Christmas morning started exactly like every other year in the Hart family home, which is to say it was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to make one daughter feel like a princess and the other feel invisible. My mother Margaret was bustling around in her signature red velvet robe, acting like she was hosting the royal family instead of just her two daughters. The cinnamon rolls were burning slightly at the edges like they always did. My father Douglas was insisting on lighting the fireplace even though the thermostat was cranked up to 72 degrees, and my sister Jenna was arriving at exactly the right moment to be adored by everyone in the room. I'm Claire, and I've been watching this same Christmas morning show for 28 years. The tree blinked from its corner with those same gold bulbs from my childhood, every ornament cracked and chipped but never thrown away because tradition apparently required us to pretend everything was perfect. My mother wore her fake smile like armor, her cheeks pink with excitement, and in her hands was a small gold-wrapped box that made my stomach drop before I even knew what was inside it. Margaret turned to Jenna, my younger sister by exactly 2 years and their only real child if we're being honest here, and her voice practically trembled with joy. "Open it, sweetheart." Jenna, with her perfect blowout and rose-colored cashmere sweater, gave one of her signature gasps before she even touched the ribbon. That gasp was her specialty. She'd been performing it since we were kids, like life itself was one long audition for a Hallmark movie and she was determined to get the lead role. She peeled the paper back slowly, savoring every second of attention. And inside the velvet box was a silver house key, a literal house key. Jenna squealed like she'd just won the lottery, and I could already feel my father's proud grin forming before I even looked in his direction. "We bought her a house," Margaret announced, her voice catching like she'd just revealed she'd cured cancer. Jenna threw her arms around both of them, and I smiled. Not from joy, not from happiness, but from pure muscle memory, the same automatic response I'd been giving to their favoritism for decades. Then Margaret turned to me with soft eyes, and that patronizing voice she'd perfected over the years. "You'll understand someday, Claire," she said, like I was still a child who needed things explained slowly. But I already understood perfectly. My gift was waiting for me too, a plain white envelope, unmarked and unremarkable, placed quietly into my lap by Douglas with all the ceremony of someone handing over a utility bill. No applause, no excitement, just the sound of paper brushing against fabric and a silence thick enough to suffocate under. I didn't open that envelope right away because I already knew what it represented. It sat in my lap like something fragile and humiliating, a reminder not just of what I lacked in their eyes, but of how far they were willing to go to make that lack feel normal. Douglas had handed it to me with the same energy he used when passing the phone bill. No eye contact, no warmth, just a quiet "here you go," like I should be grateful for whatever scraps they decided to throw my way. Meanwhile, Jenna was still squealing about her house key, holding it up to the Christmas lights like it was made of diamonds instead of debt and decades of favoritism. Margaret was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, whispering something about granite countertops and walk-in closets, while I sat there holding an envelope that felt like a final judgment on my worth as a daughter. The envelope had my name written in the corner and Margaret's perfect cursive, the same handwriting she'd used on PTA flyers and Christmas cards for years. I ran my finger along the sealed flap but couldn't bring myself to open it because before I even knew what was inside, I already knew what it meant. It meant they saw me exactly the same way they always had, and nothing I'd ever accomplished was going to change that fundamental truth. I was 9 years old the first time I had to bake my own birthday cupcakes. Chocolate with too much oil and not enough sugar because I was still learning how to cook for myself. Margaret helped, but only because Jenna had ballet rehearsal and didn't want the kitchen to smell weird when she got home. That morning I came downstairs early, smiling and hopeful, thinking maybe there would be balloons or a card or something to acknowledge that it was supposed to be my special day. The kitchen was empty, no gifts, no decorations, Just the smell of burnt toast and Margaret humming to herself while she brushed Jenna's hair in the next room. That same year, Jenna had a backyard birthday party with actual ponies. Even neighbors we didn't like showed up bearing glittery presents and rehearsed compliments for someone else's golden child. By the time I hit middle school, I'd stopped expecting anything special for my birthdays, my achievements, or really any moment that should have been about me. When I graduated high school with honors, Margaret didn't even show up to the ceremony. Jenna had a regional dance competition that was apparently more important than her older daughter's academic achievements. I got a text message that said, "So proud. Sorry we couldn't be there. Go get them." Like that somehow made up for sitting alone in a cap and gown while other parents cried with pride for their kids. When I placed first at the state science fair with a fully functional hydroelectric dam model that I'd spent months perfecting, Douglas showed up 15 minutes late and left before the award ceremony because he had a golf tee time with someone important. But the following week, when Jenna landed a 30-second shampoo commercial, they threw a dinner party with champagne and framed the product shot like she just won a Pulitzer Prize. There's one moment I go back to more than I should, even now. Senior year, academic awards night. I had worked brutally hard juggling 2 part-time jobs, maintaining a perfect GPA, writing papers until my fingers cramped and my eyes blurred from exhaustion. When they called my name for the top academic scholarship in front of a packed auditorium, I walked across that stage and scanned the crowd for my family. There she was, Margaret, in the front row, not clapping, not even watching, just scrolling through her phone like she was bored. When I stepped down from the stage with that certificate still warm in my hands, she looked up just long enough to say, loud enough for nearby parents to hear, "Well, at least she's good at something." That one sentence sliced through all the applause like a knife, and even now, 10 years later, I can still hear it echoing in my head. I used to wonder if I was imagining it all, if I was just the bitter older sister living in the shadow of someone shinier and more lovable. But favoritism doesn't whisper, it carves itself into every holiday dinner, every family photo, every moment when love is supposed to be loudest. That Christmas morning, watching Jenna hold a house key while I held a lifeless envelope, I stopped wondering about anything. I knew exactly where I stood, and I knew something else too. This wasn't the moment to speak up, but that moment was coming. I opened my envelope with the same careful attention you give to a wound you already know is going to leave a scar. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letter, no personal message, just a printout of a job listing, administrative assistant at a regional insurance office, entry-level, hourly wage. At the bottom, in Douglas's sharp block handwriting that was all pressure and control, he'd scrawled, "Thought this might be more your speed." I stared at that job listing without blinking, my fingers going cold. No one in the room noticed my reaction because Jenna was still talking about French doors and cute reading nooks, and Margaret was already refilling her coffee cup like this was just another perfectly normal Christmas morning. I let the paper fall back into the envelope, folded it twice, and slid it under my leg, not to hide it, just to end the humiliation of holding it. The room was full of noise and laughter, but none of it reached me. All I could hear was the sound of that envelope scraping against itself, thin paper against thin paper, like something whispering that I would never belong in this family the way she did. They hadn't given me less because they forgot about me or because they were distracted. They'd given me less because they genuinely believed I needed less, because I'd always figured things out on my own, paid my own rent, packed my own boxes, answered my own phone calls when life got complicated. That's what stung the most, not the insult itself, but the absolute confidence with which they delivered it. They weren't being cruel in their minds. They were being consistent with the story they'd been telling themselves about me for decades. I hadn't planned on going back home after that disaster of a Christmas, but guilt has this sneaky way of disguising itself as family duty, especially When your mother calls twice in 1 week using words like your father and her back and can't lift boxes without help. It wasn't Margaret's request that got to me, it was that syrupy tone of concern layered over unspoken accusation, as if refusing to help would prove I was cold and selfish. As if decades of quiet dismissal could somehow be erased by one favor on a Saturday. So I said yes, drove the 4 hours back to that perfectly manicured house, and stepped into air that smelled exactly like my childhood: lemon furniture polish, overcooked roast, and the faint hint of something always burning that no one ever acknowledged. Jenna wasn't there, of course. She's busy, Margaret said with a sigh that somehow made her absence sound like my fault. By Saturday evening, we'd completed the entire checklist: helped Douglas lift storage bins in the garage, listened to Margaret complain about Jenna's latest boyfriend, endured a dinner where every conversation topic somehow circled back to lakehouse, renovations, and Jenna's brilliant future. By 10 p.m., I couldn't sleep. The guest room, the one I used to call mine, still had my old soccer trophies gathering dust on the shelf like proof I'd existed there once, but the walls felt tighter now, like they remembered exactly how many words I'd swallowed inside them. Over the years, I wandered the house barefoot in the darkness, and that's when I noticed something strange. The door to Douglas's office was slightly open, which made absolutely no sense. He guarded that room like it contained state secrets: lights off, blinds down, locked drawers, passwords on everything. He was obsessive about his privacy, and yet, there it was, cracked open just enough to see inside. The safe was tucked behind his filing cabinet, small and gray and unmistakably his personal vault. For the first time in my entire life, that safe door was hanging loose. I should have closed it and walked away. I should have assumed it was a mistake, that he'd forgotten to lock it properly. But something held me there in that doorway, some small voice in my gut whispering, "What do they keep locked away from you that Jenna already knows about?" I knelt down slowly, carefully, and looked inside. There were rows of manila folders, all perfectly labeled in Douglas's anal retentive way: tax returns, property deeds, bank statements, some familiar and some completely new to me. I flipped through them in the darkness, and then I found something that made my blood run cold. A sealed envelope, plain white, with writing on the front in Douglas's unmistakable handwriting, "To be opened upon death." My hands went completely still. This wasn't the will I remembered from years ago, the one they'd made such a big show of presenting at the dinner table when Jenna turned 21, where everything was supposedly split evenly between the two daughters. This was something entirely different. I opened that envelope with shaking fingers, and what I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about my family. My name was listed first, next to a parcel number for a property I'd never heard them mention. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake, but then I saw the next page: an actual deed, purchased under my name years ago, and below that, a signed authorization transferring funds using my identity. The signature was supposed to be mine, but the slant was wrong. The curl in the letter R didn't match my handwriting at all. Someone had forged my signature, and based on the bank activity attached to these documents, it hadn't just happened once. My name, my identity, my credit had been moved around like furniture in a room I wasn't allowed to enter. I sat there under the soft buzz of Douglas's desk lamp, trying to piece together what I was looking at. This wasn't just about them keeping secrets from me. They had built an entire financial narrative and written me into it without my knowledge or consent. They'd been using my identity for years, making decisions about money and property that I'd never agreed to, all while treating me like I was barely worth a job listing at Christmas. I didn't say anything that weekend. At breakfast the next morning, Margaret poured my coffee with her usual performative cheer and asked if I'd found a real job yet, then immediately launched into another story about Jenna's new podcast idea, something about lifestyle branding and authentic influence that made me want to throw up. Douglas barely looked up from his toast. I smiled, nodded, and played the role they'd written for me decades ago. By noon, I was packed and back on the road, citing work obligations I didn't bother to fabricate. The moment I got home, I pulled my credit reports and started digging into every account that had ever been opened under my name. It didn't take long to uncover the truth, and the truth was absolutely devastating. The house, my house, the one they'd hidden under layers of legal paperwork and family secrets was real. It had been purchased 6 years ago, funded through a trust tied to my social security number. The address matched the parcel number on the deed I'd found in Douglas's safe. But that was only the beginning of their deception. What followed was an increasingly tangled web of financial activity, quiet transfers between internal family accounts, reallocated funds, and at least 3 more authorizations bearing signatures that definitely weren't mine. They'd been playing financial games with my identity for years, and I'd been completely clueless about all of it. I called a lawyer friend from college who specialized in estate planning and fraud cases. I didn't give her the whole emotional story, just laid out the documents in careful order like I was trying to explain something I hadn't fully let myself feel yet. She called me back 2 days later, and her voice was calm, but her words were sharp as glass. "Claire, if you wanted to pursue criminal fraud charges, you'd have a rock-solid case. But that's not really what you want, is it?" She was absolutely right. I didn't want revenge through the court system. I wanted clarity, and then I wanted control. So we started digging deeper, quietly and carefully. What emerged over the next few weeks was almost absurd in its twisted irony. On paper, I was significantly wealthier than I'd ever imagined, not extravagantly rich, but meaningfully secure. There was the house I didn't know I owned, a small investment account that had been growing steadily, and ties to a family holding company that had been used to shelter assets during Jenna's various failed business ventures. But the most damning detail was about their precious lake house, the one they'd been renovating for years, their pride and joy, their legacy property that they talked about constantly. That house had been secretly mortgaged 3 years ago to fund Jenna's disastrous skincare line. They'd tried to fix the financial mess quietly, and Douglas had probably believed he could repay the loan before anyone noticed. But he could end T.by. The time I discovered the truth, their beloved lake house was already flagged for auction. The bank was going to take it, and they were about to lose the one thing they valued most in the world. That's when I made the most satisfying decision of my entire life. I bought it, not directly, not as Claire Hart, because that would have been too obvious. I set up a shell LLC, used my lawyer as a proxy, and submitted the purchase offer anonymously through a holding company. It was completely legal, absolutely clean, and utterly undeniable. The paperwork took several weeks to process, but when it was finally done, I sat there holding a deed in my hands, and for the first time in my life, I owned something they desperately wanted. This wasn't about the house itself, it was about history, about breaking a cycle that had been crushing me for decades, about making it crystal clear that I had seen every inch of their neglect and manipulation, and I'd chosen not to absorb it anymore. They still had no idea what was coming. Margaret kept texting me about Christmas plans, asking if I'd be home, if I could bring wine, if I'd heard about Jenna's new boyfriend who was apparently so creative and ambitious. Douglas emailed me job listings with subject lines like "something with real stability this time." I said nothing to any of it because silence, when it's truly yours, isn't weakness, it's power waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Christmas came again with all the same rituals, the same wreath on the front door, the same chipped reindeer mugs, the same fireplace burning just hot enough to make the air feel dry but never actually warm. It was all so familiar, it felt like a stage set, like we were actors who'd been performing the same play for decades without ever questioning the script. Jenna was already there when I arrived, dressed in a new cashmere outfit and hugging herself. Like the room owed her a standing ovation. Douglas stood by the mantel with his usual coffee mug, scanning the room like he was taking inventory of his possessions. Margaret floated between the kitchen and living room, humming Christmas carols, off-key and asking no one in particular if the cinnamon rolls were done enough. I placed my gift under the tree without saying a word. Plain white box, no ribbon, no glitter, no name tag. Just wait and see. We went through all the same morning motions we'd performed for years. Jenna opened a designer handbag and gasped right on cue. Margaret cried. Douglas chuckled approvingly. There was a toast to new chapters and dream homes, and I nodded and sipped my coffee and waited for my moment. Then it was my turn. I handed the white box to Douglas gently, like it might break if he wasn't careful. He lifted it with both hands, surprised by how light it was, and smiled like he already knew it was probably nothing important. Jenna giggled from the couch. It's probably socks, she said with that laugh that had always made me want to disappear. Douglas opened the box slowly, not because he was being cautious, but because he was genuinely indifferent to whatever I might have given him. He peeled back the lid, saw the envelope inside sealed with red wax, and for just a moment, he hesitated. Then he broke the seal and unfolded the papers. His face didn't change immediately, just a slight tightening around his eyes, like he was trying to focus on small print. Then all the color drained from his face at once. He read the first page again, slower this time, then moved to the second page. The notarized deed with my name on it, the property address, the lake house, the legal documentation of forged signatures, the warning letter from my attorney. His hands started trembling, just slightly at first, then more noticeably. Margaret leaned over his shoulder, still smiling because she had no idea what storm was about to hit. When her eyes caught the bolded legal warnings at the top of the document, that smile faded like breath disappearing from glass. She turned to me with confusion written all over her face. Claire, what is this? I met her eyes with perfect calm and said, It's exactly what it looks like, Mom. She blinked rapidly, then looked back down at the papers, then at Douglas. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words that wouldn't come. You didn't tell me, she said to him, and it wasn't a question. Her voice cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the way bones break when the pressure finally becomes too much to bear. Jenna was clutching her new handbag like it was a life preserver, glancing around the room with growing panic. No one was explaining anything to her, and she had no script for this kind of family crisis. She'd never needed one before. The silence in that room became thick and suffocating, like syrup spilled across expensive carpet. I stood up slowly, smoothing the hem of my sweater, and said it lightly, like I was thanking them for breakfast. I won't be sharing the lake house. Not this time. There was no reply, no argument, no denial, just the sound of legal papers shifting and Douglas's shaking hands as he tried desperately to make the words mean something different than what they clearly stated. Margaret took a step back from him like physical distance might somehow soften the betrayal she was processing. Her gaze darted between the documents and his face, and in that moment I realized I hadn't just delivered truth, I had ended a performance they'd been rehearsing for years, and I was the only person who hadn't missed her cue. No one spoke for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Douglas sat perfectly still, holding those documents like they might disintegrate if he moved too quickly. His fingers had stopped trembling now, they were just locked in place, white-knuckled and frozen. Margaret stood beside him, caught between disbelief and the much worse realization that everything she thought she knew about her family had just been revealed as a lie. Jenna still hadn't said a single word. She was gripping that designer handbag with both hands like a child holding a security blanket during a nightmare. She kept looking from face to face, blinking like someone had started speaking in a foreign language. She had no reference point for what was happening because no one had ever bothered to tell her the truth about anything. I stood there for another moment, letting the silence do all the work I no longer needed to do myself. They weren't going to apologize, they couldn't even figure out how to speak. They weren't going to explain themselves because some truths are too ugly to say out loud. They weren't even going to ask how I discovered their deception because deep down, They'd always known this moment might come. When I reached for my coat, Margaret flinched slightly, like I'd raised my hand to strike her. I hadn't moved aggressively, just deliberately, like someone who had finally decided the performance was over. At the door, I paused, not for drama, not for effect, just to look at them one last time. Douglas still staring at those papers, eyes refusing to blink. Margaret crumbling by inches as the full scope of the betrayal sank in. Jenna silent for once in her life, finally understanding that she'd been living in a bubble that had just burst completely. Just so we're clear, I said softly, I won't be giving it back. Not the house, not my name, not anymore. That was all I needed to say. Then I opened the door and let the cold December air pour in behind me like water after a dam breaks. It hit my face like truth, sharp, honest, and impossibly clean. By evening, snow had started falling in soft, steady flakes that drifted down in the kind of silence only winter truly understands. I sat in an old armchair near the window of the lakehouse, my lakehouse now, with a blanket around my shoulders and coffee cooling slowly beside me. No music, no voices, just the faint creaking of wood as the wind moved across the siding. The place wasn't glamorous or perfect. It needed new floors, the chimney smoked when it shouldn't, and the thermostat clicked 3 times before doing anything useful. But it was mine, and no one had handed it to me out of pity or obligation. They'd never meant for me to have it. They'd tried to hide it, bury it in paperwork and assumptions, comfortable in thinking I'd never look too closely or ask the right questions. I didn't feel triumphant sitting there in that chair. This didn't feel like victory, it felt like release, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for decades without even realizing I was suffocating. I thought about calling someone, maybe a friend from college, just to say out loud what I'd done and discovered and taken back. But I didn't. Some stories don't need witnesses, and some justice doesn't require applause. I didn't know if they'd try to reach out, if Margaret would call with her voice heavy with half-truths and carefully timed regret, if Douglas would send me another job listing pretending like nothing had changed, if Jenna would text me a meme like she always did, pretending we were still close. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. I honestly didn't care anymore. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't looking for reconciliation or apologies. I'd drawn a line not in anger, but in pure survival, and this time I wasn't stepping back over it for anyone. The snow kept falling, slow and certain, coating the railings and then the trees and finally the edges of the lake itself. The funny thing is, now that I finally own the one thing they cherished most in this world, I don't even particularly want it, but I needed them to know I could take it, just like they'd been taking pieces of me year after year, wrapped in silence, and called it family love. If you've ever walked out of a room and never looked back, just leave a single dot in the comments. I'll know you were here, and I'll know you understand.